Hey plant peeps, what's up? It has not been a long time since I did my last video. Hooray! I'm doing something right. I had a viewer, Elena, ask for some information about warm growing phals. And what I wanted to do was take the opportunity not just to talk about warm growing phals, but to talk about the cool growing phals, as well as the cold growing phals, and generally like give some perspective on the things that I understand about Phalaenopsis and why I'm able to like grow and bloom them as what I feel to be is well, like good, I don't know. So we're gonna like dive into this and go through it, and I'm gonna cover warm growing phals, seasonally cool growing phals, cold growing phals, which I have very limited experience with, and then also light loving or like long photo period requiring phals. Like in order for them to bloom, they need over 12 hours of light. I actually think it's only one species, but anyways, so let's dive in. First things first, I think I should actually show you some of these guys that are in bloom right now, because I've got a whole bunch that like look really great. And this doesn't happen a lot necessarily, where you have different species or like versions of species like hybrids and stuff all in bloom at the same time. And I can't take full credit for these. Some of them were purchased new, like the Zangman Anaconda and the spotted ones on the right, but the ones that tend to have more flowers I've had for longer. About probably 40% of my collection are Phalaenopsis. I have these ones on display right now, which are actively in bloom, and then I have a whole bunch that aren't in bloom, and then I have a whole bunch more that are seedlings. Check this out. These are all, I gotta be careful not to dump them. All seedlings of various sizes, and these are only half of the seedlings. I have more kind of spread out around the house. And most of the seedlings that I grow are novelty Phalaenopsis, so they're primary hybrids of the warm growing type. Similar to like this guy, or you can't see this one, or I'm gonna make a disaster here, or this one. So the trick to growing warm growing Phalaenopsis, in my opinion, is twofold. One, when they say that they're warm growing, that means that they come from a place in the world where there's no seasonal change. They're super close to the equator, their temperatures are evenly warm, and they grow in generally very humid areas. That doesn't mean that you can't grow them in non-humid areas, but it means that they need a specific set of conditions around their root zone in order to grow well. For me, the Phalaenopsis that are warm growers tend to do best in temperatures over 25 degrees Celsius, and during the winter when it's colder and my house temperature comes down, they slow down substantially or stop growing, and they very rarely bloom. The trick to growing warm growing phals is actually not that difficult, but there's a few things that we need to understand when we're growing them, which is they don't like drying out between waterings. I try to keep their roots evenly moist at all times, and I know that description is super like vague and complicated, because it's like, what does that even mean? But for me, evenly moist means if the roots are starting to silver or get that kind of dry papery look down in the dirt, like this, then I am due for a watering. And if you're growing regular Phalaenopsis, like these types, the NOIDs that you would get at the grocery store, generally you want them to fully dry out. They're different from the warm growing species in that they're able to and expecting a seasonal drying period. The warm growing phals do not. The other thing that's different about warm growing phals is that they take a lot more light. They generally grow higher up in the canopy or exposed, and it depends on the species, so I shouldn't totally say that. It does depend on the species. However, when I grow my phals, they get a lot of light. And part of getting a lot of light means that they also need really like optimal nutrients, because if they're not getting perfect nutrients, then they start getting yellowing leaves and problems like that. Interruption time. So if you're noticing on my lip, there's like a spot. It's because I got in a fight with my boyfriend. No, I'm just kidding. We were horsing around and he clipped me in the face. So I would have chosen a better day to film, but I have so many plants in bloom and some of them are starting to fade already. Like you can see the Bellina is turning yellow. So I just wanted to film right now. But anyways, that's what this is. I'm sorry if it's distracting. Because warm growing Phalaenopsis don't like drying out, one of the tricks that I've used in my low humidity, which is anywhere from 25 to 45% on a good day, I will add sphagnum moss in a higher percentage in the mix, generally about 30% within bark, perlite, and pumice. And then on the top of the medium, I'll also add an additional like coverage so that it kind of like holds the humidity inside the plant a little longer. And again, the key to success that I found that actually like ended up leading to success with all of my orchids was understanding like when to water. When we like handle or manage, care for or whatever, your standard Phalaenopsis that you buy from a grocery store, they can take a lot of like damage and like dryness, and they're very tolerant of bad conditions. But the warm growing Phals, they need even conditions. They come from places like lowland forests of Borneo where you're like right on the equator, and the entire year they get the exact same light, they get the exact same amount of water, and temperatures are also super even. So when you bring them into your home, you can still grow them and they do fine, but you'll definitely experience a slowdown in the winter, which is why they're called like summer or warm blooming Phals, but they are like technically they bloom year round. So that's kind of the like skinny on a warm blooming Phal. The nice thing about warm blooming Phals too is that they're fragrant. The one thing that I really like about Phals, like when I got started into orchids and Phalaenopsis, I was like, ugh, like Phalaenopsis are boring and everyone has them. But I've grown to have like a few appreciations for them, which is why my collection is probably like nearly half Phals. One, they're fragrant. Like a lot of the summer blooming warm Phals are fragrant, and they're like all sorts of weird smells. Like I've had cinnamon, I've had vanilla. I've smelled like one of them that I have smells like cilantro, which is like super cool. And it's like they're also like super varied. You have this like flower structure which is the same, but they literally come in every color except for blue, including patterns and stuff. So Phals are super awesome, and understanding how to grow the warm growing ones will actually like kind of improve your overall orchid growing skills in general. So one of the things that I do when I'm like potting my plants is I try and create a medium. I keep looking at myself, I'm sorry, it's like a really bad habit. I need to put like a spot on the camera right here so that I look at you and not at the reflection of myself. Anyways, one of the things that I often do is like utilize a medium that I know is going to dry out within the week. I don't want to water my plants multiple times a week. There are a couple that I do, and I can't help that. They're seedlings and things like that that are planted in smaller pots, and I don't want to like overpot them, blah, blah, blah. But in general, I try and use a medium for each type of orchid that dries out like in a appropriate period of time. So for my like warm growing Phals that I don't want drying out by the end of the week, I use more sphagnum moss, and my cool growing Phals or like seasonally cool growing Phals that I do want to dry out by the end of the week, I use way less sphagnum. So as I'm editing and watching, I realize that I kind of missed out on like a how or why. So your seasonally cool growing Phals need to dry out because where they grow, which is further up from the equator, it gets cooler, and so they're in like natural climates where the air is drier during the winter. And the reason that they bloom at that time of year is like dryness and cool air signals that spring is coming, and so they set their spikes, and then within 3 months-ish, spring is normally on its way, and then the flowers are kind of there. In our homes, and our understanding of winter obviously is like way off compared to like somewhere in Asia, but like that's kind of the like reason why you need to have cool and dry compared to the warm bloomers that just kind of like take whatever as long as it's warm. So I think that that's important to understand, because I see all these people are like, oh, I like use this medium, use that medium, do semi-hydro, don't do semi-hydro, but you have to find the like medium that works well for you. And given my like really bad climate, super dry, super hot, super bright, also super cold, I need to make sure that the medium that I use personally gives me the ability to only water once a week as best as possible. So I think that's an important caveat when growing orchids, because you can't just throw them into bark and expect them to like do fine if you live in a super dry climate. And that's something that took me like years to learn. And now, like, I love sphagnum moss. When I first started growing it, I hated it because I thought that it like would rot roots. If you're growing in 100% sphagnum moss and you're in Canada and you're like drenching your pots, that shit like plugs up. It like gets anaerobic and it kills the roots. But if you use it in a smaller percentage, anywhere from like 10 to 20%, or up to about 50%, it's like super good. It works like a sponge and holds the water in close to the roots for a lot longer, up to a week. So it's that's my caveat for that. Okay, so we talked briefly about warm growing phals. Now let's talk about like how you recognize or know if you have a warm growing phal. There's a couple things to this. One, for me, and everything I say in this is a generalization. There is going to be specific species that like break away from the rules that I'm talking about, and that's why it's always good to like research like what species go into the phal that you have. Like if it's a hybrid, like look at the family lineage and see which each one of those of the parent species requires. And if you have like 50% of one thing and like 10% of another, then kind of lean towards the 50% version. Anyways, so warm growing phals, in my opinion, based on my research, come from a specific section of the Phalaenopsis genus. So let's like kind of dive into that. When you look at the phals that we're talking about, you have the warm growing phals, the seasonally cool growing phals, the cold growing phals, and the light loving phals. So the warm growing phals come from the subgenus Polychilos. And Polychilos are an entire, like, it's like half probably more than half. It's like a very large section of the entire Phalaenopsis genus. And they tend to be, like, in their distribution around the world, tend to be grouped in the same area along the equator. Sorry, let's do this. I want to find a way that this like works. Grouped along the equator, and they generally look the same. They have that same like star structure. Some of their like lips look a little bit different, but it's pretty easy to like notice a difference. Like looking at this phal here, you can tell both parents came from Polychilos in their subgenus of the genus Phalaenopsis. Now, if we move over next to the seasonal cool growers, that includes most of the things you see in the grocery store that kind of have this type of look, where they have like large lobed petals, and their bottom lip has those kind of like tusks or spurs or like beards or whatever you want to call it. It kind of looks like an eagle diving in the middle section of the flower, and those ones are seasonally cool. So if you have troubles like getting your Phalaenopsis to bloom, and you know that it looks like this, it's probably because it needs a cool dip in the growing season in order to initiate spikes. And what that cool dip means is literally like for probably 3 to 7 weeks, you need the temperatures to go down to about 16 to 18 degrees. I have the worst memory, so I have to keep doing these interjects, and I'm sorry, but I really want to like clean up the messaging so that everyone gets it. 16 to 18 degrees Celsius. I live in Canada, we do Celsius. If you're in the States, like apply those to Fahrenheit. I think it's like around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but don't trust me on that. Go Google it or something, okay? Is consistently day and night for probably about the first 8 inches of a spike. Funny thing about that is the spike, as it gets longer, if you continue to like kind of drop down to that cool temperature and then warm it up and drop it down again, you end up with, that's how the like expert growers get that large cascading like multi-flower spike, is what I've been told. I intend on testing that out this fall with some of my more like seasonal cool growers. I want to like use my thermostat, and once the temperatures get lower, I'm going to try that. But from my understanding, that's how that works. Now, people always cut the spikes, cut like spent bloom spikes on these. I don't do that unless the like spike starts to die. This is actually a second flowering from the first one. Now this is a hybrid, and when you have hybrids, they tend to be more robust. they produce more flowers, and depending on what goes into them, they may have like partial warm growing species or genres, or species in them, which allows them to bloom in different periods. My exclusively species subgenus Phalaenopsis, like seasonal growers, they bloom and they die. So this is an example of a species phal, Phalaenopsis schilleriana, and it's from the subgenus Phalaenopsis, which is where you get those like large lobe type flowers. It's not in bloom right now because it's super seasonal. Like this thing, it requires that cold dip, and during the summer when it's warm, it grows like crazy. Like look at those roots and stuff. But then as soon as the winter hits, I get a spike, and the spikes take a long time, and this plant like grows slower than the other like hybrids. It's just part of owning species. But the important thing to know is that they're like very seasonal, and in order to initiate that spike, they have to be cold or cool, not cold, down to about 16 degrees Celsius. This is that kind of spurred lip or like curled lip that I was talking about. You can when you look at this flower, it looks like a Phalaenopsis subgenus Phalaenopsis. It's like very obvious. It has these like kind of velvety flowers. It has a very like odd lobe shape here, and they're very consistent. And the thing about the Phalaenopsis genus, and then there's Phalaenopsis subgenus. So I should have clarified this earlier. I'm kind of annoyed that I didn't. But there's like polychilos or chilos, or how the hell you say it, and then there's Phalaenopsis, which is a subgenus within the genus of Phalaenopsis. And it's important to understand that because all the ones that I'm talking about right now are part of that subgenus, not part of the entire. Plants can get very large. Like these leaves are huge compared to my hand. I always like brag about this plant because it's a massive plant, but that's just because it's a good and well-grown hybrid within the Phalaenopsis subgenus. So in wrapping that up, when you're growing the seasonally cool growers, they like to dry out. They want their roots to silver pretty consistently. So if you're trying water culture on these, they often don't do very well because that drying and wetness like cycle is what stimulates their growth. So if you throw them in a glass of water and you have like that type of phal, you're generally going to find that they don't do very well. They need the cool temperatures to help them set spikes. You can actually like get longer spikes and more flowers by keeping them in that cool range longer. And they also will take quite a bit of light. Like everyone says that Phalaenopsis they're not highlight plants, but for me, I think about Phalaenopsis leaves as like solar panels. And the more energy you can pack into the plant, then the more flowers you get. In theory, like if it was a battery, you charge it up, you get more energy, right? But like when it comes to plants, the energy is expended in flowers or growth. So if you can pack a lot of light and energy and nutrients into a plant, it's going to give you more flowers. So everyone's like, orchids can't take lots of light, or they're low light plants. Yes, they do grow in lower light areas, but not like what we have in our homes. Our homes basically are in full shade. Like when you consider that your roof is 100% shading your house, any natural light coming in through the window, if it's not like directly hitting your plants, is likely not enough to do like, to give your plant a lot of energy. So for me, the key to growing Phalaenopsis and other orchids is to give them a lot of light, but to keep them cool. Because what happens is if you put them in direct sunlight, the exposure of light on the leaf is hot, and the heat is what causes problems. Heat burns and damages the cells. The light doesn't do that. If you run your plants hot and you put them in a lot of light and you keep them cool, they actually do pretty well. What starts to be a problem is that you start running into nutrient deficiency issues if you run them too hot, like light hot. And that's because your plant is photosynthesizing and using its energy, and if you don't have like the perfect pH and the perfect nutrient levels, then they start to get like that chlorosis or yellowing of the leaves. For me, I was very opposed to adjusting pH for the longest time. And now that I've kind of understood this like principle of like optimum nutrient availability, it's made a lot more sense. When you're growing your plants bright and cool, they need more nutrients in order to like manage the photosynthetic like process. And if you can get the pH perfect and do all that, then it's fantastic. So closing that out, pH is important if you're running your plants under very bright light and ideal conditions where they're forced to photosynthesize a lot. If you're giving your plants normal like average room conditions and you're not growing them under grow lights and you're not giving them like a crap ton of light all day, then you don't need to mess around with pH in my experience. Like I said, I've grown, most of these are actually like this. I don't pH adjust on this guy. I didn't on this one. I started running an experiment recently, and so I intend on like doing that more, but like you can get really good results without screwing around with pH. The only reason pH becomes like an important factor is when you start like forcing the plant to grow under extreme conditions. But in my opinion, you kind of need to do that in order to get more flowers, because if you want the plant to like pack in more energy and like give better flowers and more flowers, then it needs the resources to do that. So that's that. Don't like freak out about pH. Honestly, I probably should just carve out a second video for that, but I wanted to make sure I addressed it a little bit. Okay, next up I want to talk very briefly about cool, like cold growers. To be honest, I don't have a lot of experience with them. I have 2 cold growing Phals, and at this point they are small and they're seedlings, and we'll see how they go. The general thing about cool or cold growing Phals is that they need to go down to about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in the winter. In my Canadian windows, I get a draft off the windows that should, in theory, put them down to that temperature, but we'll see how it goes. My only like thoughts on that is that I just wanted to touch on it briefly so that it's included in the discussion of like the Phal types. And cold growing Phals tend to have more of like a spoon shaped petal, and they're smaller, and they have like they tend to have actually like really amazing looking flowers, like kind of greens and oranges that you don't see in most of the other Phals. So you're probably not going to encounter these as much, but I think that it's important just to like broadly understand that there's like warm growing Phals, there's seasonally cool Phals, and then there's cold Phals that most people don't see because they're hard to grow. There is like one specific Phal, Phalaenopsis pulcherrima, that they grow on erect sticks when they bloom, and you can kind of see in this one that they have like a lobe. It's technically a hybrid, but it's 3/4 pulcherrima. And the key to blooming pulcherrima is to get them to have up to 14 hours of light. There was a study done, and every single flower that they had that was of blooming size bloomed at 14 hours of light. So you can see that this one here that's a pulcherrima cross, and so is this guy down here. And this one is pulcherrima by Violacea indigo, and you can see that they get, like, I give them a lot of light. So they produce a lot of flowers, which is really awesome. Pulcherrima tends to have this like reflex flower shape, which I'm not super crazy about, but you can kind of get rid of that in some of the hybrids. The important thing to note is if you have a flower that looks like that and it's not blooming for you, consider upping the light. And by upping the light, I mean both the intensity and the duration. For me, I had that plant last year and it didn't bloom, and I wasn't sure why, and it's because I had it in the front window. And the hours of light that I get at the front window are substantially reduced, especially towards winter, because our daylight hours are less. When I put it under my artificial lights, which run for 12 to 14 hours on a timer, it sent me up 2 spikes, which is pretty awesome. So that specific species, as well as I assume many of the hybrids from it, may require longer photo periods in order to bloom or bloom well. Okay, so I think that I've covered most of the like Phalaenopsis sections, the 4 sections of cool growers, warm growers, seasonally cool growers, and light loving or long period, photo period blooming flowers. What happens if you have a hybrid and you don't know which one of those things it is? Or what if you have a hybrid and it's part Phalaenopsis subgenus, and part Polychilose subgenus, which again, just to do the reminder, Polychilose, Phalaenopsis. So what happens if you have a hybrid that's half this and half that? How do you decide how to grow it? Well, it's not like a super cut and dry answer for that. Polychilose actually tends to be sequential blooming, whereas Phalaenopsis tends to be like a single flush and then they die. So now you're stuck with two situations. One, do you grow it warm, or do you give it seasonally cool temperatures? And two, do you cut the spike or do you leave the spike on? For me, I don't cut spikes. I said that earlier. I don't cut spikes unless the like spike itself has died. I let the plant tell me exactly what it needs and how it's doing it. And I recognize that like a hybrid of two plants might not work exactly how either species would, but you'd be surprised how many times you'll get a hybrid that looks like one that actually has traits of the other. I have an example here, which is a NOID Phalaenopsis that I got. Ooh, I'm gonna damage the leaf. Let's see if I can get this in here. So this is a red blooming Phalaenopsis. You see it has the structure of a classic blooming Phalaenopsis with the like lobes on the side, but then it has the texture and shape, and it's also fragrant, of the Polychilose species or subgenre. So how do you care for something like this, and when do you cut the spikes? As you can see, there's not a lot of flowers on here. It looks kind of skimpy. So what I do, I don't cut it. And you know what? It's continued to bloom from these existing spikes now for over a year and a half. The flowers are super amazing, they're fragrant, and they don't bloom at the exact same time that the warm growers bloom. It tends to grow kind of whenever. Like honestly, I think that temperatures might have an effect on it. It does tend to bloom in the winter with the rest of the more Phalaenopsis like subgenus types. But it also like just blooms whenever. And for me, I don't care, but what I do is I don't cut it because I don't want to like miss out on flowers. And there are people who think that like cutting a flower spike gives the plant the ability to save up energy for the next bloom. The reason I don't agree with that is if you're giving your plant like optimal conditions for lots of blooms, then it doesn't matter like how often or like how you try and save that, because it'll give you the blooms that you want. I promise you. Like this is a second bloom for this thing. The first one had 7, the second had 7. If you had cut it, like would you have gotten 14? Maybe, but probably not. If you really wanted to get 14 blooms on a single spike like this, then your best bet is to actually like to do the cold shock wavering thing where you make it warm and cool over the period of multiple months so that the spike continues to grow, and then as it's about to bloom, you cool it down again, and you do that over and over again, and that's how you get more blooms. You don't cut the spikes up. That is not the solution for that, is my opinion. And I could be wrong, who knows? You also end up with like very scraggly looking plants like this, which has like look at all these like ugly ass spikes. They're all over the place, and I probably should have cut them, but you know what? If they'd continued to spike, I wanted the flowers to be there. And you can see like this is the best flower show I've gotten, even though I didn't cut the existing spikes. So when it comes to understanding or deciding how to care for your phal, when you don't know exactly what it is, you kind of got to pay attention to when it blooms. You can't use the time that you bought the plant as an indicator, because they use air conditioning and things like that to subject the plants to cooler conditions anyway. So if you get a phal like this in the middle of summer and it's in bloom, it's not because it's actually like a summer blooming phal. It means that they probably added an air conditioning in order to induce blooming. The other thing is, that's sort of like on that topic that just popped into my mind. If you have a cool or seasonally cool spiking phal, if you increase its temperatures over, I believe, 28 degrees Celsius, the flowers will like burst. Not like explode, but they'll like pop off, because the plants are not, they're expecting it to be winter, which is when it's cooler, and they're waiting for spring. And if you throw them basically into full summer, then they're just like, well, there's no point in finishing this bloom cycle, I think is how it goes. Okay, so the last thing I briefly want to talk about about growing Phalaenopsis is pH. In general, I don't think the pH is a big deal. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but there are a few species that specifically require a higher pH. They grow in limestone regions as lithophytes in Borneo, Malaysia, and areas like that, and they grow on limestone rock. And the thing about limestone rock, if your rain is acidic and your rock is alkaline, then the acidity will attack and break down or dissolve the alkalinity of the rock and change the pH of the water. So a lot of people who grow
Cochlearis. This is a hybrid, but it has like many of the qualities of Cochlearis, as well as Phalaenopsis. This is a species. They tend to struggle with their care, and from everything I've been reading about it, it has to do with pH. And it is actually largely what has put me onto pH in general, and understanding that yes, pH does indeed have like a value or effect on the plants. It doesn't mean that you have to deal with it, but if you want that like optimum region of like nutrient absorption, then pH matters. Specifically on higher pH like requiring plants, not even like orchids alone, but plants in general, as the pH goes higher, the plant's ability to absorb iron is better. And so a lot of plants that require high pH water is because they've grown in areas where the pH is higher, and so they've gotten better at absorbing iron. And if you give them low pH, the iron in water becomes excessively more available, and it actually causes nutrient like poisoning or toxicity. And I think that may be the case with some of the things like Paphiopedilums, Phragmipediums, and some of these alkaline preferring plants that grow in limestone or along the limestone rocks in areas like that. So it's a smaller section of plants. In general, I don't think you need to worry about this. This isn't intended to like complicate things, but just recognize that like pH in some capacity does matter. But if you don't have the ability to mess around with pH and you don't want to, you can get like as good of effects as these initially just with using tap water. So kind of like gauge what's your interest. If you get to a point where you're like, I want more flowers, then consider messing around with pH and stuff like that.
Okay, so man, I rambled for so long, and I tried to give you everything I know. I'm gonna edit this thing together, and I think it's probably gonna be really sloppy because what I had envisioned in my head definitely did not come out. But regardless, I want to get it out because it's important, and I don't think a lot of people understand the differences in Phals and stuff like that, or if they do, they don't know the details of it. And this isn't the be all end all of details, but I think it helps give a little bit more clarification. The important thing to remember is that there's more than one type of Phal. It's like not all Phals are created equally, and so if you have one of those large lobe Phals, it's going to require different care than one of the novelty and like fragrant smaller Phals like this, which is not focusing because that is very annoying. Anyways, so like research the species that you're trying to grow, look into them. If they have that like specific structure of like the star shape, then you kind of have an idea of what they're looking for. And if they have like the big round lobed look, then you also have an idea of what they're probably requiring. I may end up filming this again later when I have better like, I don't know, structure to how it is, but like whatever. I almost forgot one thing. So on the website Here But Not, I have an article on hot and cool and warm growing Phals that kind of like outlines the exact species and how they are organized under their associated subgenus and section. So it gives you like a visual indicator of like what type of Phal you have. I think without the video, it's probably not as clear. Maybe it makes it more complicated, I don't know. But like check out the link. I'll put it in the link below as well, so that you can kind of like, if you have a specific plan, you're like, well, which one of these is it? It should help. Okay, cool, bye.
I can't believe I gotta erase these beautiful and amazing drawings, but the video's over, so it's done. Bye, amazing drawings, and hope that I don't have to do any more editing.